Hi everyone. I hope this recording is going to be clear enough. I have just noticed over the past week with some of the work that's been turned in, I've noticed some misconceptions, things like that. So I just wanted to make you a video and explain some of the concepts that I think are giving you a harder time than others. I'm going to start with our open forum project, negative feedback loop, and I'm going to use the example of glucose levels in the blood. Okay, I hope that's clear. So if we're making a negative feedback loop chart for controlling glucose levels in the blood, we need to start out with our condition, which is glucose. And I'm going to need to probably turn this sideways to do it. Let me try this. Okay, so our condition is glucose. And I'll write condition in a different color. That's the condition. Glucose levels in the blood, really. But I'm trying to keep it super simple. Our stimulus is going to be that the glucose levels in the blood are too high. So increased glucose is our stimulus. And that is detected by cells in the pancreas. Special cells called alpha and beta cells help regulate blood glucose. But special cells in the pancreas actually detect high glucose levels in the blood. So those, you wouldn't say the pancreas is the receptor, but you would say special cells in the pancreas. So we're going to call them receptor cells. Receptors in the pancreas actually receive the information that the glucose is high. So I already wrote the word receptor, so I'm just going to circle it in blue. Okay, so what happens is those same cells release a hormone called insulin. And in this case, in our feedback loop, this is not the response, and the pancreas is not the effector. It's going to lead to a response, but it's actually, the pancreas is actually the control center. So the control center would be in here. And the control center is what actually releases the insulin. The insulin is a chemical messenger. Okay, now that insulin arrives at the cells of our liver, and the liver is just one possible effector, and I'm just going to keep this simple and just use the liver, but our muscle cells are also part of the process of lowering our blood glucose, especially if we exercise. But we will come back to this in Bio 169 when we talk about digestion. For now, we're going to keep it simple and just say the liver is our effector. And what it does, some of you wrote out what it does, and what it actually does is it removes glucose from the blood and stores it as glycogen. So I can write that, let's say purple. I was trying to think of something that would be dark. Stores glucose as glycogen. Okay, so that's what the liver does. The liver is the effector. The liver is what causes the response, and the response is always going to be the opposite of the stimulus in a negative feedback loop. So the response is going to be decrease glucose. Oops, sorry. That is our response. I don't know what's wrong with me today, you guys. I'm really sorry, and I don't have time to record this, but that's the negative feedback loop for if glucose levels are high. Now, in your project, you would also have needed to do the bottom half of the negative feedback loop, which would show what happens when glucose levels drop too low. We call that hypoglycemia. But this is just one other example, and the reason I use it is because I know you have some questions in your homework. One of them asks, what is the role of insulin? Insulin is not the receptor. It's not the control center. The pancreas is the control center. The cells of the pancreas are the receptors and the control center. But insulin is the chemical messenger sent by the control center to the liver, which is our effector. The liver causes the effect. The liver is what causes the response. So you always have this order in a negative feedback loop. You have a stimulus. That information, the increase or decrease, is read by a receptor or receptors. A lot of times these are nerve cells or nerve endings. The information arrives at a control center, which can be the endocrine system. The pancreas is part of the endocrine system, or it can be the brain. And sometimes it's not the endocrine system or the brain, but almost all the time it is. So then the control center sends a message somehow, either by a nerve impulse or by, for example, by sending a hormone like insulin. But it sends a message to the effector, telling the effector what to do to cause the response. Okay, so that is just another example of a negative feedback loop. Your stimulus is always, the response is always the opposite of the stimulus. Now, some other things that I noticed that you guys probably need a little bit of help on is one of them is the directional terms. So I'm going to draw a person again. This time a stick figure. We'll make eyes and a mouth. There, that's good enough. So when some of the directional terms are really simple. So when we're talking about just toward the head region or up, whenever a person is in the anatomical position, we can even say up. This direction can be called superior. It can also be called cephalic because it's toward the head region. And then going down toward the feet, when the person is in a standing anatomical position, this is called inferior. Or caudal, which literally means toward the tail, but in this case it would be toward the feet. Superior, inferior. Then if we are talking about toward the front or stomach side of the person, that's ventral or anterior. So the stomach side is anterior or ventral. And then the back side toward the back is posterior or dorsal. Okay? Let's see. And those kinds of terms you guys seem to be pretty good with. The directional term that means toward the midline of the body is medial. And the directional term that means toward the outside is lateral. Let's see. And then the one that's probably the hardest for people is proximal and distal. So proximal and distal are terms that involve the relationship of an organ or a structure to a major joint, like the shoulder joint or the hip joint. So it's a little bit easier the way that I drew this figure. Let's use this leg down here. Let's use the, if we're looking at this, this would actually be the right leg, okay? Okay, so this is the right leg, and so up here, of course, would be the hip region. Where I've drawn the circle is the hip region, the hip joint. And we've got structures all along the leg between the hip joint and the toes. So if I asked you a question like, how would you describe the position of the toes in comparison to the knee? You would say the toes, because the toes are here, knee is here. You would say the toes are, since they're farther from the hip than the knee is, the toes are distal to the knee. And then if you reverse that, if I ask you what position is the knee in comparison or relation to the toes, you would say the knee is proximal because the knee is closer to the hip than what the toes are to the hip. So you're comparing the distance of that structure to the hip joint. The knee is proximal to the toes. Okay, so there was one that asked the pollex. There was a question that asked the pollex, which is the thumb. You have to know that. The pollex is blank to the olecranon. Okay, well, you have to know a few things. You have to know the pollex is the thumb. And you have to know the olecranon is the elbow. Okay, so what we're talking about are structures located along the arm, and the main joint that that is related to both of them is the shoulder joint. So in relation to the shoulder joint, the thumb is farther away. So we're going to use the term distal. The pollex is distal to the olecranon. Now, if you reverse that, you would say the olecranon is proximal to the pollex. Let's see another one. The sternum is blank to the heart. Now, this is not distal and proximal anymore, but the sternum is blank to the heart. Okay, well, the sternum is the breastbone, so you have to remember the heart is not in the center of the chest, but it doesn't really matter in this case because what you've got is let's see. All right, here's a person's head, neck, shoulders. Okay, so up here is the chest, and the heart is going to be on the, more toward the, I'm just trying to make sure. Okay, so the heart's going to be over